Thanks so much, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here with us this evening, packing room 110 almost to capacity, and so many people joining us online. I'm Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan, Director of Interreligious Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. And this is the opening lecture to our annual Interreligious Studies Conference. This year's topic is Compassion, Mutual Care in Troubled Times. Vancouver School of Theology is located on the campus of UBC on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. And we are very grateful for the collaborations and the learnings that we are able to partake in, especially as they continue to inform our Indigenous Studies program here at the Vancouver School of Theology. Our guest speaker this evening is Dr. Terri Gibbons. And I have a few notes for introducing her. I promised her it would be short, although there is a ... in the outside. Terri Gibbons is Professor of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. She has written books and articles on immigration policy, European politics, right-wing politics, and more recently, the role of empathy in bridging social divides. At the Center for Higher Education Leadership, Terri advised universities and tech companies on innovation and excellence. And I'm sure you give unique definitions to those words. At McGill University, Terri advised the provost on responding constructively to anti-Black racism. At the University of Texas, she was vice provost, and at Menlo College, she was the provost. She's committed to developing leaders with an understanding of the importance of diversity and inclusion, while also encouraging personal growth through empathy. In the fall, our Encountering the Other course, and I see some people from that course here, our Encountering the Other course read Terri's book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And we were really moved by the way you, Terri, balance intellect and emotion, a personal, interpersonal, and political understanding and growth, the way that you were able to speak frankly about what is both helpful and hypocritical in religious communities, as well as sharing a large chunk of your life story and origin story. So thank you very much for joining us, and it's over to you. Thank you.
And I have to point out that Laura and I share a love of flip-flop shoes. So, okay, so if we can go to the slide. Cool. And please take your time, take your time sitting by this spot. There's a couple spots right there. And move. A full house tonight. Okay, so when we were talking about this, how I would approach this talk, one of my favorite words is integrity, and next to empathy. And so we decided we would call this Radical Integrity and Leadership. And as we go through the talk tonight, I'll be, pulling in the different ways that empathy and integrity work and how they kind of worked in my life. So as you will see, and as my book points out, this is very much a personal story, as well as my story of the research I've done, all the different ways that I've been involved in the community. But in any case, let's go ahead to the second slide. Next slide. I wanted to start with this because compassion is one of the points that you will be discussing during your workshop. And I really like this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. It takes empathy, patience, and compassion to overcome anger, hatred, and resentment. And this really rings true during these times. As an American in particular, I'm very concerned about the situation. And so I really think it's hard during times like this to have empathy or patience and compassion. I think somebody's got their mic on the Zoom. But in any case, so let's go ahead to the next slide. And if you're on Zoom, make sure you're on mute.
Talking about Stanford, UCLA. So yeah, we see awesome.
I think there's a button to leave all.
That's right. Those are all the books. Medical rights never go.
Okay, are we good? All right. Okay, so I just wanted to mention, because it is an integral part of the story, my background. I'm a first generation college goer, and I'll be talking a little bit more about my family, but I did my undergrad at Stanford, where I met my husband, who's back taking pictures. And I have to admit, he helped me through my PhD when we were living in LA at UCLA. My first job as a professor was at the University of Washington in Seattle. I grew up in Spokane, as we were discussing. And so most of my family lives in Seattle now. And so actually being at UBC was a good move for a variety of reasons. So I was at University of Washington, and then we moved to Austin. And actually both our careers took off there. That's when I was promoted to be a vice provost way too early in my career. I'd just gotten a tenure when they promoted me to a vice provost position. Did that for 3 years and then went back to make sure I got promoted to full professor. And then went on to be provost at Menlo College. And most recently, before UBC, I was at McGill University. I actually left academia for 3 years after being a provost. I was a provost for 3 years from 2015 to 2018. I left academia. Probably heard the mention of the Center for Higher Education Leadership. I really wanted to promote, higher education folks learning to be better leaders. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way of that. So when McGill came calling, I said yes, particularly because it was after the summer of 2020, and they had just launched their strategy to address anti-Black racism. And so I worked with the provost for a couple of years at McGill on hiring Black faculty, trying to create more of a sense of belonging for Black faculty, staff, and students, and so on. And then the decision to move to UBC was about family. I want to be closer to family in Seattle, and also have a shorter flight to California, which is where my husband and I still have a house, and I'm back and forth all the time. Somebody was asking me, how long it took me to get here today. Well, it's a mile I have an apartment on campus, so it's almost exactly a mile from my apartment to here. And then my office is just around the corner in the political science department. But in any case, I've studied. So I started off studying the radical right in Europe in the mid-90s. And I first became aware of the radical right in 1986 when I studied abroad in France as an undergrad. Because in 1986 was when Jean-Marie Le Pen was on the rise in France. And so I was one of the first Americans to even pay attention to this topic. I have a book called The Roots of Racism, where I talk about the fact that oftentimes it takes having new perspectives, people who come from different backgrounds, to actually pay attention to issues that others may not consider. Also, there weren't a lot of people studying immigration politics in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was doing my work on that topic, at least in political science. And so that's become a growing field, a subdiscipline within political science. And then I did a book on anti-discrimination policy in the European Union. And then, as you can see, radical empathy, the roots of racism. And then I've got a new book coming out on October 21st called Reckoning, which is a follow-up to radical empathy, and really emphasizes how do we take action. Here gives some clear examples, talks about theories of change and so on. So my publisher was thrilled that I was willing to write another book on this topic. But it's really, and as I will explain, it's really about how do we create change. And that's kind of the underlying push for all of this. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so somebody was asking me, how'd you get to this topic? Well, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, first of all. And one of my favorite episodes is called The Empath. And it's a story about how Kirk and Spock and McCoy end up, kidnapped to this strange planet where they meet this woman who is an empath. But she's more than just an empath in terms of feeling. She actually can take on people's, not just their pain, but their actual wounds and so on. And so she takes it on and she feels their pain. And then eventually she can absorb it and it goes away. But in any case, I thought that was so cool. I always wanted to be an empath and be able to not only just, feel how other people felt, but also to be able to take away their pain. And then my new favorite Star Trek show is Strange New Worlds. I'm firmly convinced that they chose Anson Mount to be Captain Pike because he's appealing to women over 50 in particular. And it's so funny because he has this perfect hair and people make all kinds of jokes about it. But there was a show, one of the shows I was watching, and you get to the end of it, and this is the subtitles from the closed captioning, and he actually talked about radical empathy. And I was like, even Captain Pike talks about radical empathy. So that was very exciting. But I became aware of things like empathy early on, when I was probably in my early teens. And, and having been raised Catholic and, growing up very much interested in, kind of what was going on in the church and so on. I think just the whole idea of empathy and justice really was something that was important to me. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, I was raised Catholic, and I'm the youngest of 7. So if you can see the picture, it's a little bright, but I'm the baby being held by my mother, Leora, and my dad, Roy, was in the military. And so I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers, and then along came me. So there's my mom was very prolific in many ways, but it was interesting that I was kind of an afterthought, you might say. She was hoping to be done after having had 6 kids, and all of a sudden I came along. But I always told her it was the best thing that ever happened to her. But in any case, she was, she always said she was very determined. Once she knew I was coming, and even though she, these days she wouldn't even be considered an older mom. She was like 34 when she had me. But she would have been, considered kind of an older mom, and she was very determined to have this last child. So. In any case, and then on the right is a picture of my dad. It's a little hard to see with the lighting, but I call this is one of these things is not like the other picture, which is he's the only Black airman. He wasn't an airman at this point, but this is the NCO Academy, and this is 1962. So I was born in 1964, so this was 2 years before I was born. And, my dad, actually, I opened the book with the story of how my dad passed away from a heart attack in 2001. And, this picture I only found a few years ago. And, he always talked about how, as being African-American or Black, that you had to work twice as hard to get half the credit, right? And he really did experience that. But seeing that picture, made me realize how much my dad and I have in common in terms of often being the only Black person in the room, or, being a leader and, not having a lot of other people who look like you around. And so, that was always an interesting thing to me, how he, managed his time and his talent while he was in the military. And so, along the way, I feel like my parents really tried to instill in us, a sense of justice, a sense of, what it meant to be, connected to the world in many ways. And I ended up going to Gonzaga prep school in Spokane, and I'm still on the board there. I was, very interested in, kind of the whole structure of religion. And I read a lot, even into college, about different aspects of religion. And unfortunately, a lot of times being raised in a church in Spokane, our parish, I saw, a lot of hypocrisy, like people who would go to church and, be proclaiming their faith and so on, and then they'd walk right out, and as soon as they walked out the door, they'd be talking about people. So, it raised a lot of doubts in my mind when I would hear people, gossiping about other people or saying negative things and so on. And so, there was really, I basically consider myself kind of a fallen away Catholic, even though I'm very much involved in my Catholic high school and so on. But, I had to find my own path to what I believe, what my spirituality is and so on. By the way, the picture of me running at Stanford is gratuitous, but I did run track at Stanford for 2 years. But being a first generation college goer, coming from Spokane, Washington to Stanford, it was just mind blowing in so many different ways. And part of it was the racial factor, right? Stanford, there was a decent number of Black students. But I was like hit with some dilemmas even before I got to campus. The first was that, they asked if I wanted a Black roommate. And I was like, well, I didn't grow up around a lot of Black people, frankly. I grew up in Spokane, which is less than 1% Black. And in my high school, there were 9 Black students out of 900. So I don't feel particularly the need to, have a Black roommate. And then when I got to campus, they had a separate orientation for Black students, but it was at the same time as the orientation for my dorm. And I was just like, why do I have to choose here, And anyway, so there was always this feeling that, well, do I do this or do I do that? And I call my 20s my years of cognitive dissonance because, there's all these shoulds, and everybody deals with this, in their teens and 20s, right? It's not unusual. But I think the difference is for those of us who are racialized or come from different backgrounds, especially being first generation, you don't always know what you're doing or all the rules. I've got story after story of, different ways just being a first generation college goer or even going to grad school was, had its challenges. But, part of it had to do with, kind of the differences that people have when they are coming from kind of more low income backgrounds or different communities, right, that aren't as connected into, that elite world of higher education. And in any case, I made it through. Actually, I finished at Stanford and decided to work for 6 years. I ended up working for 6 years between undergrad and grad school because I was kind of burned out. I always say I wear my Stanford ring every day because, I was working 20, 30 hours a week while I was going to school full time and for the first 2 years running track. And it was a lot. So when I got out, I was like, okay, I'm ready just to work for a while. But then I was encouraged to go back to graduate school. And, that was a really good experience from a variety of perspectives in terms of the support that they gave to minority students and first generation students. And I had a really good cohort of friends who helped me make my way through grad school, as well as a future husband who helped pave the way as well. But in any case, I really feel like, getting through my 20s and trying to kind of consolidate, these ideas about who I am and what I should be. You always feel like people are trying to put you into boxes. And, that's why I felt like I struggled to a certain extent because, well, Black people think I should act one particular way or talk a certain way. And when I'm around white people, they make assumptions about who I am. But also, it's trying to be your own person, right? And that's what it came down to by the time I got to my late 20s is it's like, I just have to be who I am, Terri Gibbons, and, once I figured that out, so many other things fell into place. And, I had to stop trying to meet everybody else's expectations. And so, I'll talk in a minute here about, how I kind of developed these ideas around radical empathy. But the most important thing was to have empathy for myself and to understand that, we live in a world that for everybody, nobody escapes the pressures of peer pressure and, the way you should act, the way you should worship, the way you should, there's all these different ways. And, the ability to say, this is who I am, and, this is how I'm going to be in the world is really important. And I talk about what I call my steel core, which I feel like I got from my mother, Leora. She grew up in Louisiana, and rural Louisiana, Opelousas. And in the 1930s, my dad was born in 1928 in Pittsburgh, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And, they had to travel all over the place with kids in the military. And, I just feel like he just had such a strong sense of self. And, she wouldn't let things rattle her too much. And so I feel like I inherited part of that ability to kind of put things in perspective. And she had her issues, believe me. I talk about the mental health issues and challenges that she had. But on the other hand, she raised 7 kids and, traveled as far as to the UK and, all over the country with my dad when he was in the military. And, the ability to do that and to have come out of a, Jim Crow South and, with an 8th grade education, because that's as far as you could get in rural Louisiana in the 1930s, was, it's pretty remarkable. And, for my dad, he made the choice to join the military and, served his country for 20 years and was always very patriotic. And, despite the fact that, everybody, they didn't tell us a lot of the stories, but he had stories. And, even when I was little, I remember we were moving from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, right across from Canada, back to Spokane. And, we drove the whole way. And I didn't even realize until, pretty much more recently, working on this book, they couldn't stop at hotels, right? Because they didn't know if they would even be allowed to rent a room. Now, this is like 1968. And, having to live, and, Dad still tell the story. My mom was very light skinned. And one time they did try to stop at a hotel and the guy was like, "Oh, are you with a white woman?" And it's just like, oh my gosh, that could have been very dangerous for him. She's not a white woman, she's black, but Creole. You may have heard that term lately, Creole. If you're paying attention to what's going on with the folk. But in any case, there were a lot of things that, I wanted to understand about my family, about the way I grew up, the reason my parents chose Spokane, Washington for us to grow up in. If you think about in the 1960s, mid to late 60s, my parents met in Los Angeles, and a lot of my mom's family was in Los Angeles, and, they could have moved back there, but, they chose Spokane, mainly because they thought it was going to be safe for their kids. And if you've read the book, Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, that book had a huge impact on me because it really made me understand, like my mom was part of the Great Migration from Louisiana to Los Angeles in the 1950s. And, my grandfather on my dad's side, both my grandfathers were sharecroppers. And so they had to escape the South, or at least my mom did, and my grandfather. And, the main reason they did it was they wanted a better future for their kids. And so I remind myself all the time, I am my ancestors' wildest dream. The fact that I've been able to get an amazing education and become a professor. I mean, I was writing a blog post at one point. It's like my dad's grandfather was a sharecropper. My mom was a seamstress. She worked in the textile industry in LA, and I'm a professor. In two generations, well, it's more generations, but it's a huge shift. And the reason that was able to happen is because of choices my parents made to a certain extent. And so I'm a family genealogist. I've been learning more and more about the family history and both sides. My mom's side is easier because it's the Catholic side and they keep good records. But I'm learning more about my dad's side. I actually just found it's an interesting thing. My dad's name is Rusilius Gibbons Jr. His dad was Rusilius Gibbons. And I just met this guy who, he actually went to Stanford around the same time I did, but we never ran into each other. So his name is Charles R. Gibbons. Well, we started talking and he's like, oh, my middle name is Rusilius. I'm like, what the hell? That's like one of the most unusual names you could ever think of. And it's his middle name. So anyway, we need to catch up more, but it turns out our families are probably related. And anyway, it's very interesting. But anyway, so enough about that. Let's go on to talk more about radical empathy. And I'm happy to go back and talk about family stuff if you guys want to talk about that more. But let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what is radical empathy? I mean, I think in telling my story, I'm trying to talk about like the different identities we have. And when we get to the end, I'll have a little homework for you guys. But the reason identity is important is because we all have different identities, right? Within one person, there are multiple identities, right? I'm a mom, a teacher, I'm athlete, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that I feel like I did in preparation for all of this was really, I've always been very introspective, trying to get in touch with my identity. When I talk about my years of cognitive dissonance. And, once I kind of came to peace with who I am as a person, it was easier for me to think about how that identity was formed and how that had a role in, both my ability to, do more in the world, but also how I helped others. So, it's about, I talk about integrity because to me, integrity has, it does have multiple meanings, right? It's about physical integrity, so taking care of myself physically. It's about having integrity in terms of being honest and straightforward with people. And then it's about, integrity in terms of structural. And, when you think about things being solid and having a solid foundation. So I really think that storytelling is so important. And I'm sure you guys hear this because, storytelling is such an important component of what we do as teachers and as pastors and so on. And, for those who maybe don't feel as comfortable or, the way to tap into kind of the storytelling side is to think about your family stories, like your life experiences. And that's what led me to structure the book the way that I did, is that, people are interested in the data about, when my dad passed away from a heart attack, the first thing I did was, I'm a researcher. Why, he was only 72. Why did he die from a heart attack so quickly? And, I looked it up and it's like one of the worst risk factors, one of the top risk factors for dying from a first heart attack is being an African-American male. So that was shocking. And then, there's many more just on the I have a whole chapter just about the medical side of things and, how shocking it is that we still to this day have issues around, for example, regardless of education level or income level, Black women are still more likely to have poor maternal fetal and health outcomes. And I remember when those stories were coming out, luckily I already had both of my boys, but it's just horrifying. It doesn't matter how well educated you are, you're going to be treated badly in the healthcare system, right? And we see that with Indigenous here in Canada as well. So anyway, being able to tell these stories not only elicits sympathy, empathy, compassion, it also helps us understand our own ways that we deal with these issues, right? It's how do we make our way through a world that can be so awful sometimes. Excuse me. And I apologize, allergies, so. That's one bad thing about coming back to the Pacific Northwest is my body says, oh, I recognize all these pollens. But in any case, so I was, being a researcher and, a writer and so on, I had to figure out, okay, how do I pull this together in a way that makes sense? And so I realized for me there's 6 steps to radical empathy. The first is a willingness to be vulnerable. And that's why right from the get-go, when you open the first page of the book, you're going to see me being vulnerable. And I really think it's important to be vulnerable. And a lot of people will say, well, you're so good at being vulnerable, but I can't be vulnerable that way. Well, it's not about being vulnerable with others. It's about being vulnerable with yourself. The hardest person for me to be vulnerable with was not other people, it's with me, right? We have a really hard time. Even just, giving yourself a pat on the back is hard, right? I mean, and if you're willing to be vulnerable and say, yeah, today was a bad day, or I just, being understanding with yourself and acknowledging, oh my God, if you read about, the ways I tried to deal with how my parents, raised us and so on. I mean, I had to be extremely vulnerable to be willing to delve into those stories. And I thank my siblings for helping me understand some of the history I wasn't around for before I was born. But the reason that's so important is, and like I said, it's being vulnerable with yourself, is that you need to become grounded in who you are. And that's an ongoing process. So don't feel like any of this is an end all be all. It's, we have to constantly be, because of course who you are is changing. I'm not the same person at 60 years old that I was at 40 or 20. And so being grounded in who I am is extremely important, and it's a process that's ongoing. The body I have today physically is very different from the one I had when I was running track at Stanford. And as I was saying, my back is bothering me. I got arthritis in my knees. It's like, but you have to be vulnerable and say, hey, honey, slow down. I can't walk as fast as I used to. But by being grounded in who you are, that's to me where that steel core comes in, where I can say, I have integrity. I can take care of myself because I know who I am, and I'm grounded in that, and that's what keeps me moving forward. It also allows me to be open to the experience of others. So a lot of times, if you look at people who aren't so open to others' experiences, they have no sense of self. They don't really, they may not even like themselves. I'm sorry, I can't help but look at Donald Trump and think he must really just not like who he is, because he just has there's nothing there. But opening yourself to the experience of others, we become more whole people ourselves, right? Because we understand that other people have different experiences, and you may not, one of my friends, gave me this line, which is that empathy is not absolution. Just because I empathize with you or I'm open to your understanding your experiences, it does not mean I agree with you. It does not mean we have the same opinions. However, it does mean that I will try to be open to understanding who you are. And then, of course, practicing empathy. Empathy is not something that comes naturally to all of us. It's not something that is, okay, I got it done, practicing empathy. No, it's constant. And I have to have empathy for my students when they are begging me for grades at the end of the semester. And the interesting thing is I try to find little ways to have empathy. like when I'm flying out, you know, like when I'm getting off the plane, I always say something nice to the flight attendants because I know their lives have been hell lately. And then what makes it radical is taking action. You can have empathy all day long, but if you don't take action, it's just sits there. So taking action is really, really important, and creating change and building trust is the probably hardest part. You know, if we look at the process of reconciliation in Canada, that's been a huge you know, push towards creating change and building trust. And that trust takes a long time to develop and build. And unfortunately, we're seeing what happens when you have somebody who has no interest in trust or creating change in a way that is only in his own interest. But in any case, you know, so you know, you'll see I have it as the radical empathy is circular. It's a constant movement towards, you know, becoming who you want to be. As you know, but you know, you want to have goals for yourself that reach beyond where you are now. But it's also, you know, you want to have a process to get there. And you know, I don't always meet my goals of being open to others' experiences, but it's something I can work towards. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So as I said, I really believe storytelling is an important component and a way we can tap into our own integrity. And you know, starting with your family. And obviously not everybody has had good family experiences. Certainly my family, we've had many, many ups and downs. But actually, you know, at least for me, and this is something everybody has to decide for themselves, how you manage those family relationships. But for me, it's been helpful to, you know, understand, and don't worry, you get the slides. It's fine if you want to take pictures, but okay. You can have free access to the slides. But sometimes family is the hardest part, right? Because it's so personal. You know, being vulnerable with yourself, of course, can be extremely hard, but because these are people who you have blood relationships with, and sometimes those relationships aren't what you want them to be. And, you know, I've had to learn my boundaries with family members. So just because I have empathy, as I said, empathy is not absolution. It doesn't mean I have to, you know, say everything is okay. No, it's not okay. And sometimes people do things that I don't believe are good for anybody. And so, you know, that's an important component. And for me, it helps me tap into my integrity because I have to create those boundaries and make sure that I understand where I fit into this broader picture. And then the community. For me, you know, wherever I've lived, I try to be engaged and involved in the community. That's why I do talks like this. That's why I've been on now 10 nonprofit boards. I'm currently on the board of my high school in Spokane. And to me, that's also tied to education. I think that, you know, my story of being a first generation college goer is very useful for, you know, even the kids in my high school or some of my students. And I've always been involved in organizations one way or another that are working with youth. Because I think it's really important. I have a story to tell them that is hopeful and that can help them understand they're not alone in, you know, learning the unwritten curriculum, as we call it. And, you know, what does it mean to you know, go to college and be the first person in your family who, you know, does it and so on. Health is a huge factor. I'm dealing with more and more struggles around that as I get older. But even understanding the things, you know, my parents went through, you know, my dad had a heart attack at 72, my mom had a stroke at 75, you know, why those things happen, how to understand, you know, how that is a big part of our ability to, you know, function. And then love and marriage, I tell the story of how my husband and I got together, and that was a time in my life where I was kind of working through, like I said, my own internal dialogue. And, once I realized that, it's best to be with somebody who makes you better than, basically the two of you together is more than the sum of its parts, right? It's like, when people ask me what's important in a relationship, it's like, well, you want to be with somebody who makes you a better person. And, and it's reciprocal. I do make you a better person, right? And then, just in general relationships, who do you have relationships with and so on. And then, of course, your work. Work is a huge part of our lives. I think sometimes we forget how important it is to, make sure that our work is something that, regardless of what you do, it's that you take pride in it, that, it may be, something that you don't want to be doing, forever, but that where you are right now, it's important that, your work is a part of your story. How does it fit in? And I like this quote from Sean Ginwright, who wrote The Four Pivots. It's like, the culture of our organizations isn't built for self-reflection, especially in higher ed. You would think that's not true, but no, I mean, having been a leader in higher ed, we are not very good at self-reflection. We don't really, we have a tendency to think a little too much of ourselves, and we all could use some humility. But also he says that using a mirror is really hard work, and it's a process, not a quick fix. So that's very much fits in with my own understanding of how we have to be constantly thinking about the ways that who I am is impacting the people in my life. So and that mirror is really important. Okay, so let's go. Oh yes.
Could you maybe elaborate further on how, like you said, the culture of organizations isn't built for self-reflection? Like, how is that manifested or expressed in workplace situations?
Oh, well, sure. So that in case you guys couldn't hear, the question is, how does that not being built for self-reflection manifest itself in the workplace? And so I'm a change agent. When I go into any position, I'm like, okay, where can we improve? Where can we, do things better? And people don't like that. In fact, as I talk about when I was at University of Texas at Austin, which things have just gotten even more extreme there. People don't like it when you come in and say what you're doing could be better, right? And people. The first thing I would often hear when I would start a new position is, this is the way we've always done it. And if you tell me that, that's my first clue that maybe it's time to change, right? So thank you for asking that question, because it's really important to understand that that's, basically we get into these cycles where, this is the way we've always done it, and, it's working, why fix it? And the reality is you could be doing things so much better. And, I really got involved quite a bit, especially kind of in between being a provost and going to McGill, kind of innovation in higher education and, some new ways of thinking about it. And it really changed the way I think about even, my own teaching, and that, there's no reason we can't start looking at new technologies, how do we bring, I'm kind of enthusiastic about bringing AI into the classroom. I still don't understand it necessarily, but I don't think that we should just say, oh, we aren't going to, you can't use it, I think I'd rather teach my students how to use it, first I have to teach myself, than say, oh, this is, I'm used to just standing up and lecturing, and that's how I'm going to teach, the rest of my career. And I see this, from teaching to, the bureaucracy to so many different aspects of the way we work. it's really difficult to create change. And so, and it's because we don't like to reflect.
And what are some of these reactions that you get when you come in and you introduce change?
Well, for the most part, I've been lucky that people have been open to it. But as I talk about, and some of my experiences is, people, basically will complain behind my back, and sometimes there's jealousy about my quick rise into leadership positions.
Yeah, be honest.
Yeah.
Of course there would be.
Yeah, and so part of it for me is understanding, why, or is having empathy for those people who feel threatened, right? And it is threatening to have this, young, gung-ho, Black woman coming into a position when you've been doing things the same way for 20 years, and so it's really interesting that especially in higher ed, we cling to the way we've always done things a lot. And I look at faculty now who are when I started, even they don't even teach us how to teach, right? In your graduate school. So I remember my first job was at University of Washington, and I got there and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to every teaching and learning workshop that I can do. And I got all the books and learned about active learning. And unfortunately, though, the incentives aren't there to put, a ton of energy into teaching, because everything revolves around research. And so, I had to try and find some balance between, okay, I really want to be a good teacher, but I also have to do all this research and raise a family and all these other things. And so, it's gotten better as things have gone along. My take on it is in higher ed that things started changing in the late 90s, early 2000s, when more and more men who were coming into the profession had wives who were working, not sitting home typing up their manuscripts. And, they had all the same childcare duties. And so that's when you start to see the change happening. It's still at top research places, it's still hard. But I think the reaction is often, going behind somebody's back and, getting the rumor mill going and things like that, which is unfortunate. But, I recognize it for what it is. And as I feel like I experienced a lot of gaslighting throughout my career. But by being able to recognize it, and see it for what it is, like I said, it didn't diminish me in any way. Actually, it diminishes the person who's trying to do that to me. And so, a lot of people wonder why aren't you back being a provost or a president? It's like, that's not what I want to do. I want to be in the classroom. I want to be able to, say what I want to say and not worry about if it's going to be, the headline and the Globe and Mail.
And when you've been in that spot, you made that impact and moved on. Mm-hmm. Do you worry if they carry on?
Yeah, I do.
With what it is that you have hoped to entrench there? Yeah,
and actually in most instances, a lot of the institutional changes, like, I created 2 new majors at University of Texas, mm-hmm. So things like that are still there. And, but the real legacy to me is the students I've worked with, and the people who benefited from, when people still, call me and say, oh, won't you apply for this provost position?
And then do you follow up? Michelle Obama said something about when she goes and she does her work, say for instance with young women, one criticism that she hears is that no one comes back to follow up. Like, you go there and you do something, mm-hmm. and then we move on as professionals. We have a promotion, or they go on to the next project, mm-hmm. or what have you. Then do we follow up?
Mm-hmm. And I don't succeed in always doing that, but if you look at my Facebook page,
just in general,
and my LinkedIn page,
by all means, yes.
I love maintaining relationships with former students and colleagues, and that's why I won't give up Facebook, because of, it's funny, it's like, from when we lived in Seattle to Austin to, we moved around enough that I feel like, Facebook is the only way I can stay in touch with people. But even if they're not there, sometimes they're on LinkedIn, or sometimes I just reach out. And it's not easy to do. I get busy and, things fall through the cracks. And that's normal. And that's the other thing, is you can't beat yourself up about that kind of thing. But anyway, I should move on. Thank you for those questions. So let's go to the next slide. And I see that we'll come to the questions in the chat in a bit. So I just want to mention, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about cultural humility, but I think it's important for people in leadership positions to practice. So the cultural humility came along because of the fact that people were talking a lot about, cultural competence and so on. And the problem with that is people feel like, okay, I've done it all. I'm culturally competent now. And it's a never, again, like radical empathy, it's a never-ending process. And we have to increase our own self-awareness. And that's I haven't talked about this in much detail, but one of the things and reasons that I did this book as well is to understand my own bias and where it came from. And why, again, it's the self-reflection. It's, I was raised in a place where I wasn't around a lot of other Black people. And I, at times in my life felt really uncomfortable in spaces where, people came from a different cultural background and so on. And so, but, that was one of the hardest things to accept about myself, is this is the way I was raised. I can't do anything to change that, but I can change how I go forward. And so, there's these lifelong self-reflection processes that help us, basically learn from the people around us, and whether they're clients or colleagues or friends. And cultural humility is being willing to say, I don't know everything. The reason I pull this in is because a lot of times, we do the workshops and, even this, right? And they're great, but it's this is why you guys are here, right? It's an ongoing process. We all have more to learn, and it's something that helps us, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, what an Indigenous land acknowledgement was, and I grew up where the Spokane Indians, were, and so on, and and I learned a lot more, in the last 20, 30 years about, what that all means. And so, having cultural humility means I am willing to be open to understanding how our perceptions of all these things have changed, and how even, in my own writing and the way I approach particular issues, I change because of what I've learned, what our society has learned, and our willingness to be aware of what our biases are and where they come from. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so I want to talk again briefly about inclusive leaders. We talked about integrity and so on. And to me, this whole point of integrity comes from these components, and a lot of them are reflected in the radical empathy approach. But this comes actually from the Harvard Business Review, and they talk about having visible commitment, articulating authentic commitment to diversity, challenging the status quo, holding others accountable, and making it a personal priority. And people ask me, well, why did you go to McGill? And I'm like, because the leadership not only said they were going to make changes, they did. They went straight from, we have a problem, to here's how we're going to fix it. And so I really believe, obviously it was a ground up movement in terms of where the push came for change. But if the people at the top don't believe in doing the work, then, it can get stalled out. And so that's why I was willing to go to McGill and even come here to UBC, is the fact that the leadership has committed to creating change. Having humility. Too many leaders are, full of themselves, basically. It's good to be modest about your capabilities. And here's where, vulnerability comes in. You have to be willing to admit mistakes. And I really believe that if you have integrity, that's not so difficult to admit mistakes. It's like, I'm a human being, I'm not perfect. And, awareness of bias, showing you that you have personal blind spots, as well as the systemic issues, right? We know that the system is set up often in a biased way. And, we talk about meritocracy, but what does that mean? It's not just that you hire people who look like you or are really similar to you. It's being willing to look beyond that and say, no, this person is the best person for the job, even though, we don't have a whole lot in common. Then there's curiosity about others, having an open mindset, listening without judgment, and seeking with empathy to understand those around them. And then cultural intelligence is being attentive to other cultures and to adapt as required. I think that's pretty straightforward. And then finally, effective collaboration. And this is something that is really a hallmark of my leadership approach. Is it's so important to empower others. And even in working with my students, it's really about, especially my graduate students, about empowerment. I'll help guide you, but this is about you finding a way forward in your research and giving them the support they need, and understanding that they may think about an issue differently from me, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And then providing psychological safety, and if you have a team, focusing on team cohesion. And, I can tell you, I hear from people I've worked with over the years, the reason I've had the path I've had in higher ed, where, I was telling a friend, like, well, I always seem to be in a situation where somebody's like, trying to pull me in to a new position. And so it's a nice feeling knowing that people want me for who I am. I don't hide, anything about myself. And what you see is what you get. And that's kind of been my story, throughout my career. And sometimes it works out great. Sometimes maybe people, feel threatened or don't like that approach. But to me, it's, again, a matter of integrity. And I really believe that if I can be in a position and be who I am, that's the right position. If I'm in a situation where I have to hide part of who I am, or, don't feel comfortable, then, that may not be the right position for me. Okay, let's go to the next slide, which is your homework. Identity mapping. So one of the things when I do longer workshops is I have the group get together and do their own identity maps. And one of the reasons we do this is to think about ways we're connected. So I talk about bridging racial divides or bridging social divides. And one way you can do that is by thinking about ways you can connect with people that may not be what you just externally see, right? So, I showed you my Star Trek thing. Well, a bunch of us are like cheering along Star Trek. So we have a connection there. Or, we just took a trip to Vancouver Island, and I love being out on the beach and looking at all the sea life. And, that's another way I might connect with somebody. So, there's kind of the first step of just, who the heck am I? I'm a photographer. I volunteer, I do all these different things. And in some ways it's good just to do that as a, practice, where, in a sense, almost thinking about what are my priorities? Is family my priorities? In my career? Where do these different parts of me come together? And so there's various ways you can do it. But it's a useful, way to approach thinking through, especially that process of, willingness to be vulnerable and becoming grounded in who you are. And in a sense, it's almost like you're creating a force field of this is who I am, and you can throw things at it, but this is who I am, and that's important to me. Okay, so we get to our last slide, and then we can ask even more questions. Thanks for the questions you've already asked. But so there's my website. I did bring a few books that I can sign afterwards. But my next book will be coming out in October, and it's ready for pre-order if you want to do that. But yeah, as I said, you'll get all the slides, so you can go to those links. And yeah, I think I'll end there. And you can go to questions. Yes.
I would like to ask a question, but before I ask the question, I'm going to model it. I would like to suggest that people who are asking a question stand up and ask it in a loud voice, because I think the acoustics of this room are such that people on Zoom can't hear once people around the room are talking.
Yes.
I think the way that you describe empathy as kind of a lifelong pursuit, it's not just you show up one day and you have a good feeling about someone, it's a lifelong pursuit, it's really profound. And you also talk about empathy in such an understated and personal way. And I'm going to say some things before I ask my question, which is mostly, my question is mostly help.
Yes.
But like the things you are talking about, they're not easy. Having empathy for our ancestors with all the good and the bad that their choices brought to us, dealing with the expectations that are placed on us in a charged environment. We might open social media for some entertainment, and then what we get is whatever perspective we have, people are ridiculing it and calling us names. Cultural humility, once you start to get defensive about yourself and your identity, how do you keep being open, right, to changing? And then to just, well, as long as I know who I am, I'm okay. But how do you find who you are amidst all of this craziness?
Yes.
Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, so do we have another hour? And I know and we'll come to the questions on Zoom. Maybe we can alternate between in the audience and Zoom. But so this is the hard part, right? You're asking the hard questions, which are how do I reconcile myself? Yeah. So the thing I've been grappling with lately is the fact that my mother's Creole. So on her side of the family, I know I have German and French heritage. Not only that, but I found out right after I was starting to teach at McGill, having moved from California to Montreal. I'm on this family tree site, and they send me this thing that says, "Oh, it's the birthday month of your ancestor from Quebec." And I'm like, "What?" And so I look, and indeed, I have an ancestor who went from France to Quebec, probably was in the military, and then when the British came in, it was shipped down to Opelousas, Louisiana, where the French had a outpost. And not only that, I also found out one of my ancestors, again on my mom's side, was a proud Confederate soldier. And I'm just like, holy crap, how do you reconcile within yourself these crazy, linkages? And, it's like, okay, I identify as Black. And so there's that whole history. But can I deny, this other part of me? And I'm still grappling. Let me tell you, I still struggle with that because, we're in a moment right now where we want to say, no, we have to take responsibility for this history. So as a person who's been racialized, who has ancestors who are enslaved, and yet I have ancestors who were, killing indigenous and, pushing indigenous out of their homelands, basically. And, I I think one of the things I'm coming to is that we're kind of a sum of all of this, and all of us are. So I try to think about it in the context of history, that we're all part of that history one way or another, and we all have ties to it in different ways. And again, it comes back to acceptance. I have to accept the fact that, if I look in my family history, there's these evil people and there's some really good people. I have an ancestor who, so I went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is also known as the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And, once I had heard it was going to open, I was like, oh, I have to go and see this for myself. Not knowing at the time, even when I got there, that I might find an ancestor. And so, I get about halfway through, so it has these poles that come down, and each pole is a county where somebody was lynched, and it lists the people who they know were lynched. And I got about halfway through, I'm like, oh, what was the parish my mom lived in when she was growing up? Oh, yeah, St. Landry Parish. And is it possible I might see a name I recognize? And it hadn't even, I had no idea going into it. I get to the St. Landry Parish, and there's Julian Stelly, which my mother's maiden name is Stelly. So I got my hand again, boom, I'm looking up, who's this Julian Stelly? But yeah, he's a relative. He was, and there's actually a story that made it into, the reason he's listed there is because, they know his story, which is in 1880, I believe. He was registering to vote, and as a black man in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, and the Ku Klux Klan came to his house. He ended up shooting a few of them before they killed him. And one of the interesting things about this is, there's all the, when you go into the family tree software, there's all these different, pathways you can look at for different families. Well, some of the family trees had erased him. They were ashamed of the fact that they had an ancestor who, basically been killed by the Ku Klux Klan. And, so that was really interesting. So, we all have elements of our history, some that we're proud of, but even things you think they would be proud of, sometimes people aren't. And, I know, like for my parents, we didn't interact a whole lot with a lot of my relatives, most of my relatives, frankly. And I've only got to know some of them as I've gotten older. And so, an important component of it is being willing to understand in the past, right? And being willing to say, yeah, it's ugly history, but I need to know it. And I think that's what's kind of helped me along the way, is to say, okay, I should, at a minimum, be willing to be open to, understanding, my parents' generation, born in the 30s and so on, they didn't want us to know that history. I didn't learn until I was writing this book that Opelousas was a place where there had been one of the biggest massacres of Black people in the country. 300 Black people were killed when there had been a white teacher had come to, after the end of the Civil War, to teach and get the Black people in Opelousas registered to vote and so on. Well, they ran him out of town and had a rampage, and it's, you've probably heard of some of the other massacres, Black Wall Street, et cetera. And, 300 people they think were killed. And, sometimes I think about that. It's like, damn, how did my ancestors even make it through all of this? I had posted something on Facebook recently about there's a quote at the end of the movie Black Panther where Killmonger says, he's dying, and he says, bury me in the ocean, where my ancestors jumped in and they didn't want to become slaves. And I was like, well, no, that's not right. I'm here because of my ancestors who didn't jump off of the ship, who said I may be going into bondage, but I'm going to live. And I think it actually, in some ways took more courage to live than it did to jump off And not knowing what kind of, I mean, can you imagine the uncertainty and even, I could go on and on. But my point is that history is ugly, and I think it's better to know it and understand it and be willing to say, but I'm here to do better.
Right, and when we fall into the trap of, the world sets up binary expectations for us and we want to align here and we feel so caught, we have to realize that if we're going to buy into that binary, we are without a doubt denying so much of our own selves.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, yes, and then we'll go to the.
I'm asking this question on the behalf of one of my colleagues and participant who is in Tehran. And she's there and she's a psychiatrist and a researcher. And she also wrote the article with me for this conference. So we had the discussion about, it's a general question about empathy and compassion. So there's a difference, and it has been said at least that compassion is practically you are helping out someone. But in other languages, like Persian, Arabic, and even Hindi, we are not able to find this distinction. So could you please listen?
Yeah, and I actually do talk about that in the book. And language is so important here. And actually, I'm right now working on a paper where I'm talking about how language is, and even in terms of doing research, how we use terminology so differently, and how that influences the way we think about things. And so, as an English speaker, to me, compassion doesn't have the, that's why I say radical empathy, right? Because to me, compassion is good. Yes, we want to have compassion. But, I can have compassion for somebody and still do nothing. So that's why I even didn't want to say just empathy, right? So compassion is, I see you, you're struggling, I feel for you to a certain extent. Empathy is actually saying, I'm going to put myself in that. Not only am I going to put myself in that other person's shoes, and as I say, I firmly believe in do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but you have to go a step beyond that and say, I'm going to do unto them though they may want me to do them to do unto them, right? Because what I want is probably very different from what they want. So just saying I'm going to treat them the way I want to be treated isn't enough. I have to be willing to say no. And to be able to treat them the way we want to be treated is you have to be willing to understand their perspective and be open to their experiences, right? So to me, compassion can be a good thing. I just don't see it going as far as it needs to. And empathy is a good thing, but I push for radical empathy because, too often, in the next book, I talk about the difference between apathy and I think the opposite of empathy is apathy. And I say that because apathy is when we're just, I feel bad that that's happening. But what can I do? And it comes back to Laura's question, right? It's like you throw your hands up and it's just like, the world is crazy. You can't do anything. And that's why every chapter of this book ends with things you can actually do. The Reckoning book actually goes further and says, here's, ways you can get involved. And, the interesting thing to me is that I've been able to incorporate taking action into my research, into everything I do, because, when I was doing research on anti-discrimination policy in Europe, I got involved in an organization, the German Marshall Fund, that was working with young people on both sides of the Atlantic to get involved in politics. And I said, this is a great way to, do anti-discrimination work, but also, it's just a great way for me to get involved and be a mentor. And, I'm still in touch with several of those young people who are now in politics. One was a Lord Mayor in England and London, out in one of the small boroughs, and another has been a state senator in Michigan, and another has been very much involved in the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I have I speak both French and German, so I feel a strong connection to people from those countries. And there's so many different ways, and I tell these stories in the upcoming book, Reckoning, of how, I've been able, I feel like, this is my life, right? So I'm not just a researcher. I am, we want to pretend as professors that we are objective and, I'm just observing and reporting. No, that's not the way it works. Because of who I am an active participant in, my research. I am, a person who, is seeing things in a different way. I can take action to help. I wrote this book called Immigrant Politics that talks about how young people are getting involved of immigrant background are getting involved in European politics. So that was an outgrowth of the work I had done. And I even had the congressman we were working with who wrote the intro to that. So, I mean, for me, I've been lucky in that sense. Not everybody can do that. But I think to come back to your point is that it doesn't matter how we define these things. What's important is, kind of the steps. And yes, I may not be able to articulate it in the same way. I can still look at action, right? That's why action is so important, because it's the actions and the outcomes and the ways that we are engaging in the world that really is the important part of it.
Would you describe yourself as an activist?
Yes. The question was, would I describe myself as an activist? Of course. Going way back to my days at Stanford, when I was sleeping on the quad and complaining, telling our president that we needed to, what's the word? Divest, thank you. Divest from South Africa. So yes, I am very much an activist. I don't hide that. If you hear me talking on the CBC, I loved it when I was able to say, they were asking me about Trump and the Medicare, Medicaid thing. And he said, well, Trump says he's not going to cut Medicaid. I'm like, I am not afraid to say that Donald Trump is lying. Because he is cutting Medicaid and Medicare. But anyway, I'm okay. I have no problem describing myself.
Should we take a last question from Zoom?
Yes, please.
Joseph, you want to choose one?
Oh, okay.
Is there a comment from board from earlier?
Yeah, I'm in the comment here. So this comment talks about AI.
Right.
The reason I am opposed to AI is the extreme amount of energy which requires on a aging infrastructure. This is particularly problematic in high energy demand regions, such as the Women's where AI production facilities are.
Yes, I agree. So there's the whole, I understand this side of it a bit because it actually works in the tech industry and we talk about, energy usage and all that. But yeah, I mean, it's problematic. The way that AI and crypto, all of that uses data centers and energy and water, all of these things. And, I don't really have an answer for that. I mean, the reality, I don't really use AI much at all, if at all, except, it actually is annoying to me that you go into Google now and the first thing you see is AI. I mean, even my email, it's like, it does, I hate it because you'll see the little AI summary on your email and then you go in and it's a complete opposite of, so I wish I could I don't know if there's any way to get rid of it, but unfortunately it's almost being imposed on us. And so, and also, I hate the fact that it uses a lot of resources and energy, but on the other hand, it's they're going to solve that problem eventually, one way or another. And I hear so many different things about it, that they're going to hit a wall with it, et cetera. And the reality is, as a teacher, I can't ignore the fact that my students are using it, right? It doesn't mean that I'm going to go in and learn, all there is to know about AI, because that would definitely take too much energy. But at a minimum, I feel it's my responsibility to pay attention to it and, to say, okay, and even be very upfront with my students and say, look, I know you're probably using AI. Please be careful. And, or we're going to, if I really want them to be able to write, have them be writing assignments in class, things like that. Yeah.
So this will be the last question.
Sure, it's kind of silly, but would you be able to teach AI radical empathy?
So, actually, there was this thing where they looked
Just say what the question was.
Oh, sorry. So the question was, would I be able to teach AI radical empathy? There's a thing where you can go in to see if AI has been trained on your work. And yes, it has been trained on radical empathy. So I can say that almost all of my books have been trained, AI has been trained by all of my books. So, and unfortunately, we don't get any compensation for that. But although my publisher, Cambridge University Press, who I did one book for, actually asked our permission before they allowed, and that we would actually get some compensation. I mean, this is the huge battle right now, and with the whole AI thing is that OpenAI and others are just going in and because we know that our books are all PDFs on, our students can go pull down PDFs of our books. They know. I even will ask my son sometime, well, how did you get a PDF of that? but it's out there, right? And I will sell my books, but I don't make any money off my books, right? I mean, that's the reality. I'm hoping that my publisher, does well, by writing books, but I don't make any money off of my books. Anyway, I mean, the point being that AI is being trained on almost everything we put out there now. So I don't know if it's helping, but because they're also reading stuff that is not so great. So.
Yeah. But I guess if it has no self, then it can't do this lifelong process of self-reflection you're talking about.
That's right. There is no, absolutely. I mean, I think people have a lot of misunderstanding about AI, and that's one of the reasons I'm also trying to at least kind of stay on top of it and try to understand that, I don't think we're anywhere near getting, the Terminator or anything like that.
The Foreman project.
All right. Thank you so much for your questions.